Good afternoon and welcome to the virtual Perez Art Museum, Miami. My name is Marie Vickles and I'm the Director of Education. And today, as part of our Scholl Lecture Series, we are presenting a very special Miami Art Week program that features a conversation between award-winning Ghanaian-British architect Sir David Adjaye and PAMM Director Franklin Sirmans. Our mission at PAMM is to encourage everyone to see art as an incentive for genuine human interaction, communication, and exchange. I sincerely hope that all of you joining us in this digital space are doing well, taking care of yourselves, your loved ones, and that our program provides a moment of reflection and inspiration during the course of your day. A few acknowledgements before we get started. Thank you to Deborah and Dennis Scholl for your ongoing support of this lecture series. And many thanks to the incredible team of people working so very hard to make our education programs come together online, both at the museum and here with you all. I would like to acknowledge Anita Bram, Associate Director of Adult Programs and Audience Engagement, Alan Mueller, Membership Manager, and our world-class AV team, Denise Faxis and Andrew Bird. Thank you all. Now, let's get this program started with introductions of our featured speakers. Sir David Adjaye is an award-winning Ghanaian-British architect known to infuse his artistic sensibilities and ethos for community-driven projects into his work. His ingenious use of materials, bespoke designs, and visionary sensibilities has set him apart as one of the leading architects of his generation. In the year 2000, David founded his own practice, Adjaye Associates, which today operates globally, with studios in Accra, London, and New York, taking on projects that span the globe. His most well-known project to date, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., opened on the National Mall in 2016 and was named Cultural Event of the Year by the New York Times. In 2017, Adjaye was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II and was recognized as one of the 100 most influential people of the year by Time magazine. And more recently, Adjaye was announced the winner of the 2021 Reba Royal Gold Medal, considered one of the highest honors in British architecture for one significant contribution to the field internationally. Franklin Sirmans, Director of the Perez Art Museum Miami since 2015, is an internationally recognized art critic, editor, writer, and curator. Sirmans has established himself as one of the leading voices in contemporary art, joining PAMM from his previous post at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, LACMA, where he held the position as department head and curator of contemporary art. In his time at the Perez Art Museum Miami, Sirmans has overseen the acquisition of more than 1,000 works of art by donation or purchase, and has pursued his vision of PAMM as the People's Museum, representing a Miami lens by strengthening existing affiliate groups, such as the PAMM Fund for African American Art, and creating the International Women's Committee and the Latin American and Latinx Art Fund. Now in his 5th year of leading Miami's flagship art museum, Sirmans continues to write and edit for numerous artist and exhibition publications, making a compelling impact on the world of contemporary art. During the course of this afternoon's conversation, please post your questions in the chat on our Facebook and YouTube platforms for the live Q&A portion of the program. We will try to answer as many as possible. So, without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sir David Adjaye and PAMM Director Franklin Sirmans.
Hello. Thank you, Marie. Thank you so much. David, thank you for being here with us today. We're going to talk a little bit about the big picture. I definitely want to mention, 3 or 4 different projects, and we have images going by. But let me I have a couple of things. Thank you, Marie. Thank you for your leadership of our education department. Now more than ever, since March and the ways in which we all are dealing with COVID in various ways, but certainly for museums and programs, The education department has taken on a role, I think, above and beyond what we could have possibly imagined prior to COVID. So thank you. Thank you, Anita. Thanks to Denise and Andrew and Laz. Thanks, Lauren, Marita, Alan. Just a lot of thanks to the PAMM team. And big thanks to all of you for tuning in. We are here celebrating Art Week in Miami, a very, very different Art Week. And certainly we thought that potentially we would be live and in person, but I want to thank David so much for coming on in this platform. I also have to thank Dennis and Deborah Scholl, our friends, for making the Scholl Lecture Series possible. And I wanted to mention that in these last 4 years, we have made a very conscious effort to involve architecture in the lecture series on an annual basis. In the past, we have had Elizabeth Diller with us, Sharon Johnston and Mark Lee, and also last year, Christine Binswanger, who was the lead designer for Herzog and de Meuron on our building. So this idea of architecture and its relationship to us as a museum, as a place that does not, on a continuous basis, show that work in our galleries, I think is a way for us to broaden the conversation. Is a way for us to think about the relationship between architecture and art objects, but most importantly, community, which is the reason why I wanted to engage in this conversation with David publicly. It's something where I feel like I've learned a lot from listening to him and experiencing the buildings and having the opportunity to think about how buildings play a complementary and central role to the ways in which we share art here at PAMM, believing that art is the catalyst for conversation. So thank you, David. Thank you so much for being here. We're gonna just jump right in, and I just want to, I have to mention, you know, as I said, it's Art Week here in Miami. You have a little bit of history here. Design Miami is happening now in our design district, led by Craig Robbins, our friend. And in 2011, you were the designer of the year for that fair. You've done projects all over the world before that and since then. But I'm just wondering if you could just say a little bit about where you are today.
Gosh. Well, I'm in Accra. Thank you, Franklin. Thank you. I'm in Accra, which is the studio that I just recently reopened. It's also home now. It's definitely been home for this past year. Can you hear me? Is that okay?
Better.
Good. Okay, let's just try and get things a little bit better. How's that? Sorry. Okay, great. So really the work, you know, has shifted and has changed, and being now on the continent, I've started to focus much more on work on the continent as well as working globally. But really the sort of new body of work that's happening on the continent is really also a sort of important part of my focus right now here. Projects like the Benin Museum that we're working on, the MOA, which is a very important project that we've been sort of working on for several years, and also working in the Middle East, the Abrahamic project, and then also completing, and we're finally going on site with very important projects, the Studio Museum in Harlem in New York, going through an inquiry on the Holocaust Museum in London, and you know, getting close to getting to a document where the Princeton Art Museum next year sometime will start on site. That gives you a sort of global overview of the kind of work that's going on.
It's a lot, but you've had offices in London, Accra, and New York. Was the relocation really, did it come about because of the emphasis on where the current projects are?
It really came about because of this project that's actually up, the National Cathedral of Ghana, and the commission for that really felt as momentous as as winning the National Museum of African American History and Culture in terms of the African continent. And I felt that I moved to New York when I won that project to really steward it and to also really sort of baptize myself in the U.S. experience. And I haven't lived on the continent since I was a little boy, and it felt like the right time to come back with my young family now, and to spend time on the continent working on this project and now other projects which have come about as a result of being here.
Take us back just for a moment, because I think it does. I hate to go to the biographical, but I know that it does inform your practice. So just tell us a little bit about your formative years.
Oh, I think that the narrative you're asking about is that I was born in East Africa. My parents are Ghanaian, but I was born in Tanzania. And my father was one of the sort of first generation of diplomats of, post-independence countries, of, the sort of suite of countries, but specifically Ghana, which was the first sub-Saharan country to gain independence. And he was a career diplomat. So I sort of had a very early beginnings. That's very much, what you have in the military or in the diplomatic corps, of spending a few years in every country as the sort of diplomats or the military sort of train. So the beginning was very, I had a very nomadic beginning to my life until getting to Europe when I was in my sort of early teens. And then really that was the stability, being educated in England, and then now, being all over the world. Quick fast track version.
Yeah, but I think, there's a project that developed early, your interest in architecture, and for you to, I think, have a sort of peripatetic existence and to then document that. And I'm thinking of your Africa photographic project. When did you first become interested in architecture in that sense? I can understand being kind of astounded or interested in the world and having the ability to see so many different places and to put yourself in so many different positions very early on as being an informative part of experience. But what drove you in that direction to do something like that?
No, it's very interesting. And it almost started when I decided that I wanted to start my own practice. So more or less in 2000, when I opened my own studio under my name, when I decided to just go solo and go alone after being in a partnership with an old school friend, I at the same time realized that I was thirsting for a reconnection back to the continent. So as I started my studio, I started this private project that I did by myself, which was that whenever we didn't have any work or things were slow, I would basically take a trip to a country on the continent. And at first it was biographical. It was to go to East Africa and West Africa to the countries, and to North Africa to the countries that I sort of had been to as a young child. And very quickly, I amassed about 12 countries in a couple of years, and realized that I had a kind of significant body of images from each of these places, and it was the beginning of the sort of new millennium. So I then was teaching at Harvard at the time, and I was asked to do a show, and I decided that I would show the images of these travels, and it sort of created quite a reaction then with the school. I think I didn't realize how much people had not realized how much they didn't know about the built context of the continent. And from the basis of that, and conversations that I had around that, I realized that it sort of behoved me that there was a window where I decided that whilst I was practicing, I could visit all of the continent's countries, so 54 countries. I thought I would do it in a couple of years. A few things got in the way. So it ended up taking me 11 years to go to all 54 countries and document the capitals extensively. So, I have about just under 50,000 images of the continent at the beginning of this millennia as a sort of significant sort of research study, looking at all aspects of the built environment as well as the kind of landscape and geography. And it seems like even nowadays with everybody having smartphones that doesn't seem to matter, but actually it's really interesting how we consume still the kind of, certain kind of images about places.
Yeah.
And that somehow it's still important, this idea of surveys, which the social media and the internet can't quite allow. It's been fascinating to watch the evolution. I finished it with the sort of birthing of social media and all these new platforms coming into being.
So you called it a photographic survey of metropolitan Africa.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, to pick up on that strand. So how were you documenting? You were using a handheld camera, I imagine.
Yeah, no, at the beginning, it was the first sort of Sony cameras, and, it was really that sort of chip, the early chip cameras. And as they evolved, towards the end, I started to use, sometimes my phone, and sometimes, the really sort of miniature sort of cameras that started to happen. I was very interested in not being a sort of, I didn't want to say that I was a photographer shooting sort of picturesque images. I wanted it very much to feel as though there were pictures that anyone could take. And that was the sort of premise of the book, that it felt as though anyone could have taken these images. And a lot of people at first thought, well, that looks, why did you do that? But there was a very deliberate attempt to not be too composed. I mean, of course, every single shot that is shot is selected, and I love for a specific reason, even some of the blurry ones. But it was about a certain atmosphere and a mood and a feeling of each place that I was trying to capture with the way in which I took the photography. And it's also a sort of evolution of the technology as it fully becomes digital and very, very high resolution. So we start from very low resolution to very high resolution. And in a way, that's also documented by the book. But really metropolitan in the sense that, I wanted to be provocative with the audience, in the sense that most people just didn't understand that some African countries have 20 million plus people. And so these are significant metropolitan sort of agglomerations, which are bigger than most Western, cities. And so this idea of using metropolitan and Africa in the same sort of space was to expand the notion of the built environment as much as possible within the consciousness of people.
Yeah, no, it's like an atlas or an index. And is it something that you refer to specifically within the work, or is it more a conglomeration of thought that drives your practice?
It's a bit of both. I think at the first decade, I think that there was a one-to-one relationship with that work. I was using it very directly in my thinking and in the way I was working. I was using it as a kind of private diary whilst it was still mine. And it became less so when I published it. It sort of was a kind of, when I published it, in a way, I felt like I was sort of revealing the background to some of the things that I was looking at when I was doing the work for the first 10 years of the practice.
Yes.
So in a way, it sort of was sort of opening the sketchbook or opening the reference pages. I still look at it, and it's very important for me, but it's now, it plays a different role in my mind now, in the way in which it's, for me, helps look at the sort of nature of those cities. And whenever I visit again, I'm always thinking about the kind of development and the evolution of these cities past the images that I have.
Do you think the concept of metropolitan architecture as it pertains to Africa has changed since that time?
Absolutely. I think that just within the last, since 2010, when I finished, to this sort of the end of this decade, the continent has dramatically changed. The cities that I documented, I don't think there's a single city that looks like what I shot. There are fragments, but most have evolved. And I think it's to do with the sort of new impetus that's happening, in quite a lot of the countries. Mostly 5 or 6 countries have really become, big leaders. Yeah. And their cities are changing and evolving, and they're starting to become very serious metropolitan places, with all the complexities and issues that are besiege, the city idea. But within the sort of Black space now, I mean, these are Black cities, and
right.
Yeah.
But there's something in your work where you can see that connection with the architecture and with a historical architecture that goes even further back than what you could possibly be documenting, yourself with the camera. And I know that has played a role in the way that you go about making architecture. But I'm curious, when did art objects come into the conversation? We have some images going by, and of course, we see paintings by, I believe, Chris O'Feely, or paintings by Julie Meritou. And you have a deep, deep relationship with many artists. So, you know, as a museum director, I'm always conscious of that sense of architecture working with art. And when it finds the level of synergy that you have had, it is quite amazing. You know, I had the pleasure of being in your Ghana pavilion last summer, and to walk around in that space, to feel bodily the difference between all of the other elements of the contemporary art presentation in Venice is remarkable. And then on top of that, I know you were engaged in a conversation with the architecture of the national pavilions, of course. So just say a little bit, I know the image has gone by, but if you could tell us a little bit about this idea of not the, I don't want to say the anti-white cube, but the idea of creating a space that can be different for the presentation of artwork.
No, I mean, I think that the Venice presentation of the Ghana Pavilion, the sort of introduction of the Ghana Pavilion to Venice in 2019 was a very important moment for me and for this investigation of, you know, how to present an African country in Venice. And, you know, does one follow this sort of the format and just sort of, you know, add the work? But my problem is that I just know the trajectory and the meaning of what the white cube is and its evolution. And I simply couldn't accept that as a kind of narrative for the backdrop of this work that we were going to be showing, especially since, you know, looking at some of the artists from, you know, Elan Sui to Abraham Mahama to, you know, even Lynette Boake, who have a very specific kind of relationship to space. All three have very specific relations to space. It wasn't just going to be good enough to just make sort of dimensional geometry. So it forced a sort of an investigation into what is the nature of the sort of public space, the viewed space, or the shared collective memory of space within the continent. And what became very clear across the entire sort of region of Sub-Sahara is that this idea of the cellular single room chamber was a kind of unifying form, whether inhabited or not inhabited. And it felt like, and that the architecture at its very kind of fundamental was about a reconstitution of the fundamentals of the planet, the Earth remade again. So a kind of radical sustainability in the materiality and a sort of a radical engagement with the ecology of the planet. And, you know, I felt that this sort of, it behooved us to really understand that that was the collective memory of a lot of the sort of genesis of the generations who made that art practice. But obviously the new generation, that sort of architecture, the urbanization and the city has taken over. But in a way to recall that seemed a very important and appropriate thing. And when we started it, we suddenly realized, I thought it was going to be really difficult for the artists, that they were going to be struggling with not having rectangles. And they all unanimously were thrilled to not have to deal with rectangles and to kind of deal with a new form of space. So in the end, it was a series of ellipses. They weren't pure circles. They weren't ovoid. They were sort of elliptical forms that sort of compressed and expanded and created the geometries that we needed for the different installations. And then we brought the sort of earth from Ghana, which got through clearance in Italy, which was not an easy feat. So the consulate services did a really good job of making sure we could ship some sand to Italy from Ghana. And we got Venetian plasterers under the supervision of a really great Ghanaian sort of craftsman to plaster the walls in a Ghanaian way. And they did an amazing job. So it was a kind of transfer of sort of skill and knowledge, and it was very, very, very special project. You know, for me also, just, you know, from what you're speaking about, in a sense, my investigation, apart from the sort of built and known fragments that exist now, also exists by going through a sort of deep time. I'm very interested in going past the sense of the time that we live in as being the only relevant time to negotiate. And, I'm much more of a kind of, Einsteinian sort of thinker, in the sense that I like this idea of time being a kind of an expanse that one can actually really always, and that it exists somehow always around you, and that one can actually also somehow infer from it. So I've become very obsessed with fragments, what I call fragments that lead to illumination about possibilities of different timelines. And so for me, and I used art in the beginning of my career with the contemporary condition. I used to very much be fascinated with the way in which art practice and the contemporary condition allowed me to see each other. And, in this new work, I've been using fragments to look back in time to then reimagine possibilities of future, sort of modes of architecture that look back further than our own time. So sort of art objects and artifacts have become profoundly important to me as sort of fragments of memory, and also as sort of deep diving tools to imagine different possibilities than the built environment that my eyes can see now.
Yes. And there's another element to that. The architecture coming out of this deep inquiry around art and around culture and how they go together, but also this very direct engagement with community in a broad sense. You have remarked several times, you said it has to be for the community first and an international site second. Now, and I know that's in relation to a project we'll get to, but I'm just curious that idea of bringing people together in space obviously is at the heart of the museum endeavor. You could make buildings for many, many different ideas or occasions or purposes, but you have chosen to work within this space. Where does this concept of community come from for you?
It's sort of, it's many layers, many folds, but in a way, I think that fundamentally, the sort of my responsibility or my sense of duty to the subject of architecture, which is a profound art form, one of the sort of grand art forms of our civilization, spanning back to the earliest formations of cities that we know of, as much as 10,000 years, has this duality in it. It sort of it is to the patron that is to the commissioning agent, but to the notion of society and civilization. And I very quickly, for me, sort of logged into that idea that one is making an architecture and looking down two bottles at the same time, which is a very kind of slightly, disorientating thing, but something that an architect has to learn the skill of, which is, yes, I'm answering the brief. Yes, I'm talking to my client. I'm making a place for the people now, but I'm also speaking to a time that I might not even be in, and also thinking about the relevance of an architecture beyond the sort of immediate trajectory of the sort of commission. And so when I speak about community, I speak about community in deep time as well as community in the immediate sort of perspective. And I'm very fascinated by this idea of working in this duality. It's, in the end, the work has to engage. For me, the most successful architecture, beyond the picture or whatever else, has to engage and empower that community, because that's the win that is the most important win of all. And when that community engages with it, when the rest of the world catches up with it, then you have something that has some kind of relevance, sure. But if that community doesn't engage with that work and find a sort of relevance to it being in their context, except for just an imagery, if it doesn't empower and edify them, I love that word, edification, it doesn't edify them by kind of dignifying their space and making them feel like that's something I want to be part of too, or that's a place that I want to negotiate, then I think that the architecture has a kind of phenomenal problem of basically, pedaling backwards. It's failing from day one, and it's pedaling to try and engage. And, it's, once you lose the audience, it's very hard. People try to repaint buildings and tart them up. Yeah. But it's very hard to regain the audience if the sort of initial gesture doesn't show a certain relationship to the generosity of public spirit that is required in a public building.
Yes. Gosh, that's something we're thinking about so much here in this week right now. It's some people would say, well, if you don't have Art Basel, what do you have? And And I think part of this week has been for us all to come together and say that we are here first and foremost for our community every day. And we want the world to come, but we are here for that experience first and foremost. And that's what informs us and our mission.
Exactly. I think that this COVID time has been very clarifying for really re-understanding the importance of the local and how the local and the international are twinned, but you can't work without the other. You have to, be very cognizant of your arena and then how it kind of expands. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I want to touch briefly on the Edo Museum, which is also in process right now, and something that has a little bit of a longer time frame, I guess, than Studio or other smaller projects. But that Edo project.
Oh, the IMOA. Yes, we have an acronym now for it, which I want you to say. IMOA. IMOA, the Edo Museum of African Art.
Perfect. It is intended to house some of the Benin bronzes, I believe. And I have to just, touch base on that conversation. Not so long ago, I believe someone was arrested at the Quai Branly in Paris for attempting to retrieve some objects and repatriate them potentially. And, as a curator who has explored this concept in an exhibition, this exhibition Neo Hoodoo, which was inspired by Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo, which is about, of course, retrieving the objects from the House of Art detention on 82nd Street and 5th Avenue, AKA the Metropolitan. This is an amazing project you're working on. I think there is a lot to be said. How do you feel about that kind of relationship, not contemporary art objects, but historical art objects? We find it an interesting question for us here dealing with modern and contemporary art in an overwhelming sense. You have the artist around to guide you most of the time, or at least a sense of proximity to its creation. Now, this is quite different when we're talking about objects that have been created so long ago.
Yes, and IMOA is, I think a very radical proposition by the sort of Legacy Trust, who are this very interesting group of, different parts of civil society who've come together and are really working with the governor of Edo State to create this extraordinary museum. It's extraordinary in the sense that it is a house to return back restituted objects, but it is about the retelling and the re-empowering of the community, of the narrative of the history, the deep history of Edo State, and particularly Benin and the royal families of Benin, who were the Medici. They were the Florentines of, before Florence was even Florence. They were the Florentines, of Africa. Those royal families single-handedly created guilds and created a patron base that sort of created the sort of magnificent bronzes and artworks that were the sort of adornment of their world and their public life and their private life and their sacred life. And, in a funny sort of way, by the sort of extraction that has happened, people know the story, but the communities in those places, I always say that people think that Africans have the access to the information because they're somehow on the mother continent. Well, when it's been taken away, you no longer have a kind of, or what I call a providential relationship to those objects, and you don't have that aura. And it's been amazing listening to how artists actually have been at the forefront of saying that we want these works back because they are part of our evolution and trajectory back. It's not just about reflecting on the contemporary life and sort of painting trauma or difficulty or hope, but it's also about looking deep in time and being able to project forward. So IMOA is basically a tool to teach the community about the kind of incredible patronage of art in those communities from 1,000 years ago, and how that needs to be understood and enjoyed again by the communities now, because we now know that art and that sort of practice in the creative sector is part of the rejuvenation of the 21st century of cities. And two, it sort of creates a wonderful link to, this museum is a sort of hybrid of an art narrative in the sense that it has the historical collections. It has collections that have been inspired by it that will also be coming back to it. but it also has a contemporary art museum. It has a 10,000 square foot contemporary art space to be able to engage with shows around the world, but to also enable finally in the region to have a phenomenal state-of-the-art space that can engage with showing the work of these great artists that are in the education system that is really, really good, but are not, there is no built infrastructure for those shows to happen and for other institutions to see them. So there's that sort of layer to it. And then there's a kind of whole community offering about archaeology, which is also then connected to school groups. There's an archaeology that's going to happen on the site, which we're going to build around education programs, lecture programs, teaching programs, and then a sort of a scholarship study program that will happen as the restitution of objects is happening, as excavations are happening, to kind of build a scholarly sort of institution that moves from the inside out. It's not about getting objects in and learning about it and trying to talk about the world. It's about uncovering its own history. For me, it's about uncovering this extraordinary history, which is just under the feet of the people, and for them to really use it as the vehicle to really transform themselves in the 21st century. So I'm very excited about this project. I think it has profound ramifications on, I think, what the museum means in West Africa or on the continent. A lot of people talk about, what kind of museum are we going to make? What does the museum mean in Africa? Well, what the museum means in Africa is a tool to re-empower the sort of extraction and to learn from those forms, so that the future generations can actually be in relation to these profound histories that belong to them. It's not about the empire and showing the produce of empire to edify your people about global exploit. It's about the kind of re-teaching of the tools of your history and then using that to project into the future. So this is the profound difference. And I think it's the direction that institution building on the continent will take, because that is the single narrative that almost in every now nation state, the debate is about. What is the museum? And then that's why there's a lot of difficulty in the political circles about why should we build a museum? There's always this conversation on the continent about why should, we have a lot of things to do. But now I think the debate is becoming clear that, there is, of course, the kind of basic needs of hospitals and things like that, which are very important, but there's also the spiritual and cultural needs of the people to edify. And that comes through understanding their own deep history, through the provenance of objects and the kind of dignity of spaces that show that history to those communities. So it's a very special project.
Amazing. And you say, we're using the term museum, but what you're talking about is a different language around how we use the museum in a physical and meaningful way.
Exactly. Incredible. Exactly. It's not about, it has overlaps with the traditional term of that word, but it expands it and it opens it up in a very new way.
And healthy overlaps with that idea of community-centered kind of thinking.
Exactly.
Incredible. One other thing I want to touch on before we move to questions is monuments and their relationship to history. Obviously, you speak of history and its relationship to physical space, but there's also something amazing that you're doing with monuments, and you're working on these monument projects in a way similar to other architectural projects.
Yes, no, it's another area that I've become obsessed with, which is the production of monuments that reflect the fundamental issues of our time and the battles that have been placed and for me overcome, and the way in which those lessons have ramifications for future generations so that erasure doesn't happen. I think what we're all seeing with the sort of world that we live in, and I'm not saying monuments solve them, but I think that monuments actually significantly contribute to the aura of the environment that people live in. And if you don't see, monuments that consecrate certain moments in history as being very clear, I think that there are profound kind of erasure kind of conversations that happen. For instance, in Britain, 20% of the population doesn't believe that the Holocaust happened because there simply isn't a Holocaust memorial of any significance in any public place in Britain. One of the allied countries that sort of, liberated the world at that time. So it shows how profound the problem is. And this idea that somehow the monument is no longer relevant because we've sort of gone past it and we have the digital age or whatever is completely irrelevant. We're haptic beings. and we live in physical space, even though we are also digital beings. And physical space has a profound oral effect on us. And I think that what we're learning is that also the monument is no longer a plinth with an object.
Right.
It's a narrative about space. It's a sequential system that engages the user in a new, much more complicated way about seeing and introversion and reflection. And that opens up a huge canon of possibilities of how we can understand that in our built environment in terms of negotiating tragedy, trauma, or fantastic stories of heroism that
Yes.
that need to be celebrated, because we realize that in our society. I mean, for me, it's very clear that we have to celebrate these moments, and the acts of building are the acts that are the kind of fragments that future generations will look to. I just think that towards the late 20th century, we sort of stopped building monuments, and actually, the architecture disappears, but the monuments stay. They stay longer than the architecture, actually. So as if we're human beings, I think that this idea of making monuments can never be erased. It's part of the very nature of being here and telling stories about what our civilization is doing on this planet.
Yes, and kind of a selfish two-part question. So this past summer, in light of Black Lives Matter, in light of all of the kind of dual pandemic that we have put a focus on, shall we say, because we knew it was there before, right? It's not new. Just down the street from here, a statue of Ponce de Leon was splattered and vandalized. And I'm curious, and I'm often trying to figure this out: are there good ways of dealing with the past in terms of not only the history but also the actual physical embodiment?
I think that with monuments, you're never right or wrong. I think that what you're doing is taking a stab into the future. And I think it's completely correct that future generations reject monuments. That they say, actually, that character, on further reflection, 50 years or 100 years or 200 years from the event, is not the kind of character we want as a model. And I think that we should, as a society, respect that and take them down. They're not tombs that are somehow defining us. And I think the monument is a sort of time capsule. It's a trajectory that says this is the ethic we believed in, and let's hope that it still makes sense in the future. It needs to make sense. And if it doesn't, it needs to stop and it needs to be replaced. So I think it's a very active thing, and it's not about the morality of right and wrong. It's about really, I think the lesson is looking at the lens of the decisions that were made about how we chose to consecrate that monument.
Right.
Did we choose to consecrate it by erecting fictions or erecting some kind of narrative that makes sense of the time and the things that were felt to be overcome in that time and the great losses or horrors that were overcome for that time? And I think history judges it very brutally and very honestly, and I'm sort of deeply grateful for that.
Oh man! Before I could go on, but before we move into some questions, I want to say thank you for our National Museum. It is, of course, in DC, in the capital of the nation. I have spent countless hours in there from the moment it opened, up and down, down, up, trying to figure out this feeling. Looking at it with pride from the outside and seeing very consciously the things that you were talking about, the things that you saw in your exploration of metropolitan African architecture, very clearly and obvious for everyone to see. And you are also finishing up a project in New York. And this is the museum that I grew up in, so I feel very strongly and passionate about it. And also, it is this other beautiful human being, Thelma Golden, who you are working with on this project. When will we see the new studio museum in Harlem?
I think in 3 years' time, 2023.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and it's happening. And I'm so thrilled and honored to be working on this project. And it is, and I know it is sort of the backbone of so many of us. I got my first show in the US at the studio.
Of course.
So it's such a profoundly important institution to sort of take the next step in its evolution from just, from its sort of guerrilla days, as I call it, as just a little sort of shop front, to
Yeah.
being a sort of rehab, to now being a fully fledged figure, in the cultural landscape, and not just a fully fledged figure, but a fully fledged force
Yeah.
that really is so required. So that for me is a very personal project that I hope and truly believe will sort of cement, with the other institutions, 125th kind of contribution to the American identity as a very important avenue in America, cultural production.
Yeah.
So feel very much the weight of that working on that project.
Can't wait to see it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to pass over to Anita for a couple of questions from the audience. David, thank you so much.
Such a pleasure, Frank.
Thank you both so much for a really terrific interview. It was amazing to hear more about your work. I'm going to get quickly to it with a bunch of questions from the audience, with the first one being from Kiana. She said, "Thank you for this series. A question for David. Do you see architectural influences from the continent and other places and designs around the world?"
No, I think that unfortunately the continent hasn't been used as a reference for contemporary architecture for a while. There was a little moment post-war where certain regional sort of European architects were obsessed with the Dogon and things like that, but it hasn't happened. But I think that it's such a rich history, and it's going to happen. It's happening already with the new generation who are very confident about using the fragments, as I call them, and the sort of remnants, and really reimagining new possibilities.
Great, thank you. I have another question from Michelle on Facebook. She says, Adjaye has spoken about his love of making books alongside making spaces and buildings. What books are missing? What forms of publication does he think the architectural field needs today?
Well, so much. and I just think there is a lot of history that still is uncovered. I'm still working on books. We're working on a significant other sort of tomb that I hope will, we've had to pause for a little bit, but I'm working on a whole sort of volume set on the Caribbean right now, which I'm very excited about, which will probably be the next thing in a few years. It's a sort of very deep dive into the nature of island life and architecture and the diaspora. But I think that it's incumbent on all of us to kind of uncover as much knowledge as possible, because that just makes the world a better place and makes the world a more precise place and less about cliches and stereotypes, which I really don't have time for. And I like information and knowledge as a kind of nourishment of communities and society. That's why I love making books.
Thank you. Looking forward to the Caribbean collection. That hits close to home for us. Okay, I have another question from Marie. She says, you speak about the future. In relation to the study and work in the field of architecture, can you share how you are fostering the future generations of architects and builders from Ghana and other countries in the continent of Africa?
Yes, I mean, as well as practicing and all the research work, we have incredible internships, and I mentor several people across the continent. I think that the idea of the transfer of knowledge to the younger generation, and for them to find their own way of using some of the information that my generation has created is very important to me. So that is continually going on as best as I can, as much as I can. I'm working with Leslie Loco at the moment, the former dean of the school in New York, and we're looking at potentially building a school of architecture and design in West Africa that's very serious. And we have political help, and we're looking at the business community to really put this together, and hopefully that will sort of emerge and become something very significant, But yeah, the education of future generations is profoundly important.
Thank you. Thank you for that work as well. We have a question from Scott Taylor on YouTube. What is Sir David's process of deciding whether to undertake residential commissions?
It's really just to do with the nature of the client and the project. The funny thing is, people think I just do houses. I sort of don't really. I think that there are so many architects that can do really beautiful houses, that I think that you choose me when you're interested in something a little bit more than just making a beautiful house.
Great. Right, I fully understand that. Thank you. Let's see, we have another question from Jairo. Sir David, seeing your work, I've noticed your similar approach to darker, minimal, not much outdoor light entering the space. What inspires such breathtaking, beautiful, and fresh approach to your work?
Gosh, it wants to get into my mind. I don't know what to say. That's a sort of kind of open my brain moment. I'm obsessed with the noble nature of certain, profound planet materials, and celebrating them, and to really representing them, to kind of refresh them, is a very important thing. And I think that the way in which our eyes and our senses work with light and darkness is profound to our existence on this planet. So for me, working with this primary notion, and working with this idea of luminosity, either bathed in or observing luminosity, is a very profound part of what is probably the common theme across all the work, if I have to be clear.
Thank you. Thank you. I also just need to add that we've gotten a few shout outs from Thelma Golden about our cultural cathedral in the future, which is exciting. And let's see, we have another question from Aaron Hughes asking, what is your favorite structure, literally anywhere?
Oh my gosh, I have quite a few, but it's still the pyramids. It's still, of Giza. Khufu's, the first pyramid is still, for me, hands down, sort of early dynasty, Black Pharaoh builds a pyramid, still the best thing in the world. Still kind of doesn't get any better than that. And then, I love the Mosque of Djenné very much, this rammed earth, rammed mud cathedral, which is spectacular, that the entire community remakes every season, every rainy season, which is a profound sort of reference project for me. But I love many, many projects around the world.
Right, as I thought. We have a question from Kimberly on Facebook. In your design of the museum in DC, why Yoruba for the design symbols?
Well, it sort of comes full circle to Imoa, right? Because the Yoruba are really the profound monarchy, which probably affects the entire sort of monarchy structure of West Africa and the kingdoms that follow after. If you look at the trajectory, the Benin royal family really predate the Ashantis, the Songhai, all the other kind of families, and are intermarried. So for me, when I was working on the Smithsonian, that's when I really started to understand the significance of the Edo State and Benin, what is now Edo State, but the Edo Empire and Benin, and the significance of this civilization on West Africa. And I suddenly just realized that if this was the deep time for the community of West Africans that were taken to South America, to the Caribbean, and to America, then this is the deep memory of form that was kind of birthed in this place, that is really part of the collective memory that I was trying to seek to bind by using that reference. It's Yoruba, it's part of the kind of kingdom empire, but it's all part of this whole monarchy.
Thank you. I think just because we have to, one last question actually from Thelma Golden herself. Could you speak about some of the architects that influence you and your vision?
That's a Thelma question. Straight in, surgical, let's go in. There's so many, Lino Bobadi is a very, very special architect that I have a lot of time for. Jeffrey Bauer in Sri Lanka, very special to me. Louis Barragan, Louis Kahn. I managed to meet Oscar Niemeyer and spend a few days with him before he passed, in his 90s. And that had a profound effect on me, learning about how his life sort of unfolded. So I'm sort of very fascinated by these people who question identity, shift context, kind of move out of their own comfort zone and create worlds. I think that's probably a common theme of the architects that really move me.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, these questions are also great. This will be the actual last one, I promise. Hillary Jones, thank you for this discussion. I'm curious to know more about how your project on the Ghana Cathedral and Edo arts are informed by local collaborators, scholars, artists, griots, and craftspeople.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's informed by a very sort of sort of big network of researchers that work in my office. And it's tested in those communities. It's tested against the scholars that are out there. And when we find people who know more than we do, we bring them into the team. So we are very, very collaborative in that way. Knowledge doesn't belong in any one place. But I've made a significant investment in just having people just do research without any sort of benefit back, but just for the kind of the process of just having that knowledge base as a kind of archive in the office, sort of archive, as it were. So yeah, we're very interested in knowledge producers, knowledge makers, and collaborating with them, and also kind of nurturing them and employing them. I love this idea of having sort of young researchers, a job that you think you can't get in Africa. We're sort of very interested in hiring people because of their kind of expertise and being able to kind of be scholarly and to give them a place. And it's not just about a professional job that's, about, capitalism. I really love supporting that. That for me is a very important part of the way in which, I think knowledge production and knowledge sustenance can work. We all do our parts in the different fragments that we make our businesses out of.
Right. Thank you. It's about doing the work.
Exactly.
On that note, just want to thank you and your team so much for your time and for sharing your amazing practice with all of us here. We can't thank you enough, and huge virtual applause from everybody who's with us live. Thank you.
Franklin, thank you so much.
Thank
Adore
you
you, brother.
so
And everyone. It's such a pleasure to meet you all. And maybe sometime soon we can be in the same space. I'm looking forward to that.
Yes,
Indeed.
Miami next project.
Absolutely. I love Miami. I'm missing not being there.
We love you here.
Thank you, guys. Bye.